Hello, my name is Jason Smart. I'm a special correspondent for the Kyiv Post. But outside of that, I'm also a political scientist who studies Russia. Specifically, I've been studying how Russia operates both domestically and internationally during the Putin regime. And there's something really exciting right now happening in Russia that's worth noting. Something of such importance that, in fact, the war could end tomorrow if it were to come to pass. So, after Vladimir Putin launched the full scale invasion of Ukraine, he immediately took steps to try to buoy his economy, knowing that sanctions were coming. In fact, his first speeches to his own countrymen, having launched the invasion, were not as much about justifying the war as they were explaining what he was going to do to help the economy. Typical of Keynesian economics, he tried to boost aggregate demand for the government to spend more money on social programs, on the people, and of course, on the military. The objective was so that the common people would not feel the effects of the sanctions and really the effects of the war that they launched against Ukraine. The problem with this strategy is that, yes, spending lots of money in the short term will boost the economy. However, it's often likened to being a sugar high. It's temporary, but then there's a crash. The crash, the hangover that comes after the sugar high, can be quite detrimental to an economy. And we're seeing that transpire now within Russia. Russians themselves, we recognize, understand that their economy is not doing well. There's a lot of evidence for that. Since 2020, there's been an 80% increase in the amount of loans taken out at pawn shops. Likewise, in Moscow, just in the past few months, the cost of renting houses has increased by 20 or 30%. Russians don't have tons of extra wealth. So when the cost of renting a house or an apartment is increasing by 20 or 30%, it's something they certainly do feel. But there's something more fundamentally underlying this. And that's very bad strategic decisions that Putin has made over the course of the past several years. So first, let's look at the micro and then the macro side of how Russia's economy is falling apart. So first, let's try to determine what is broken. Well, we know that inflation is very high in Russia. Official government numbers put it only in the single digits. However, many economists, including Steve Hanke, a professor at Johns Hopkins University in Washington, D.C., the real inflation rate in Russia is about 24%. That would put Russia in the bottom tier of countries. But what's stunning is what would be necessary to control that inflation. The central bank has increased the interest rates over the past year. Starting at 8%, it then moved to double digits before finally ending up where it is today at 19%. And it's projected to keep increasing. Though that seems like a big jump, consider this. According to the VEB Institute in Russia, if the government really wishes to tackle the runaway inflation, they should increase the interest rates to 52%. That, they say, will provide an inflation rate of only about 4%. Increasing interest rates above 50% would wreak havoc on the Russian economy and would destroy any chances of economic growth. So, how did Russia get to this situation? Well, there's several things it did. One, Russia for years has been trying to boost the amount of children. Russia has a birth rate of only about 1.49 children per woman. Considering that the replacement rate, that is the number that you should aim for if your society is going to keep having children and continue to prosper, is 2.1 children per woman. To encourage people to have more babies, the government has been giving out favorable loans to people, where they would subsidize the loans so that people could get mortgages, most specifically. Those mortgages, it was envisioned, would encourage people to establish homes and to set up families. However, most people that took advantage of this program did not do it to have more children. They simply saw it as an investment opportunity. As the government was subsidizing people to buy more property, the effects were not ones that Putin wanted. Now 40% of Russians have loans, 25% of Russians have multiple loans, and 80% of mortgage holders are taking out additional loans for down payments and home renovations. What this has done is that Russians now have indebted themselves incredible numbers, specifically in housing. And because the government has encouraged this, the favorable loans, it has created a bubble. As Americans well enough remember the housing bubble in the United States, bubbles can be a very dangerous thing for an economy. In the case of Russia, we are seeing that that bubble is reaching the point where it is about to burst. Just in the past few months, banks have taken radical steps to try to control people's love for free money or cheap money, and there is they take out more and more loans. Now, many banks are requiring a 50% deposit or more in order to take out a mortgage, and the interest rate has moved up to 21%. The bubble, though, will burst, and the reason is simple. There's simply not enough demand for all these properties. But something more important, interest rates on those loans that people took out, those mortgages, are going up. The banks simply cannot afford to allow them to keep the lower interest rates that they had originally had in the terms and conditions of the mortgages they took. According to a report last week, should Russia's economy come under stress, specifically in the housing market, it would destroy the economy. Reports indicate that the banks would need about a 4.5 trillion ruble bailout if there was significant stress, something that could only come from the Russian government, which again produces a catch 22. Russia is printing money to get itself out of problems, but printing more problems to get out of more problems only will make inflation worse and worse. So that's on the micro level, what we see with the inflation, and we see how it's going to affect common people. Imagine when millions of Russians walk away from their properties and decide it's no longer worth paying their mortgages, forcing the government to step in to prevent hundreds of thousands of people from becoming homeless. Now, let's consider the macro level. What's going on there? Russia today, like the Soviet Union before it, relies heavily on oil and gas to balance its national budget. However, even the prime minister now has said that the national budget in 2025 to 2027 will have large deficits. But what's behind that? Well, let's consider this. Of that 40 or 50% of revenues that the Russian budget requires from oil and gas, Russia simply isn't able to sell it. About 45% of exports of oil go to China. About 35% exports go to India. But recently, we've seen India decline to be buying LNG from Russia that were underneath US sanctions because it simply didn't want problems with the Americans. Likewise, China, which over 50% of its imports and exports is done with the United States and with Europe, is not willing to risk itself either. Keep in mind, Russia is only about 2% of its trade. But fundamentally, there's another aspect of the story. Oil prices are simply going down. Saudi Arabia recently has announced that it will no longer try to maintain the $100 per barrel price that the OPEC plus countries had earlier aimed for. Now, Saudi Arabia is just going to drill, and that's going to drive down the prices even more. Russia, to balance its budget, needs oil prices to be about $70 per barrel. However, prices today are about $66 per barrel and are falling. If there continues to be a lowering of prices of oil per barrel, Russia will have greater and greater deficits, which again, it can only make up for by printing more money. But it also puts it at a disadvantage when trying to counter the effects of the worsening problems with the banks that cannot get their monies from the loans that they gave to people in order to buy houses or housing they did not really need. Overall, Russia has a very large bubble in the housing sector, but it also has falling oil and gas revenues. These two things combined, plus the huge Western sanctions, are things that are unbearable for Russia in the long term. So, what other options does Russia have? In fact, it has very few. Russia is obviously trying to work with its partners, such as Iran, North Korea, and Venezuela. But none of those countries can really offer any sort of serious solutions. The Chinese, who had been the great hope for Putin, are simply unwilling to entangle themselves in the conflict that Putin needlessly started. The Chinese are wise enough to realize nothing good will come from that. Of course, they'll take the cheap oil when they can and take advantage of the situation for their own interest. But at no point are they actually willing to have skin in the game. But let's look further. Russia can't depend on those countries. Maybe it's going to be the third world. Russia very often talks about BRICS. Maybe they'll unite. Well, just last week, during Russia Energy Week, Vladimir Putin invited a number of foreign leaders to come to Moscow to join him for the event. In total, only one foreign leader came, the dictator of Equatorial Guinea, who is said to be a cannibal and who has led the country since 1979. It made very clear to the world that Russia has no real friends and no real allies. Russia is becoming a pariah state. So, going back to where we started, how could this rapidly end the war? Well, there's several different ways. Obviously, always present is the potential for hyperinflation. Hyperinflation is something that would wipe out people's savings, as well as wipe out the salaries of people like soldiers, who at that point have nothing to gain by sticking around the military. As we saw during World War I, the Russian lines collapsed. Soldiers just got up and ran away, and they started killing their own officers. Could something like that happen to the Russian military again? I think it's well within reason. But I think there's an even more likely reason that the rapid decline of the economy could change everything. Vladimir Putin is a dictator. And like all dictators, Vladimir Putin's central priority, the only thing he really cares about, is certainly not Russia, nor the Russian people, nor his legacy. Vladimir Putin is a criminal, and he and his gang, the Russian government, are interested in how they can make sure that they stay in power and prevent their downfall. There's really no ideology to it. It's simply an interest in financial gain. But like any other mafia, there's other actors who could try to take you out. And Putin knows he's swimming with sharks. The people around him, be it his own advisors or the Siloviki or the oligarchy or people from the intelligence or military services, are a threat to him. Any one of them could decide to get rid of him. They have access, they have the ability, but they also have an interest in taking over his mafia empire. They have an interest in being the new kings. And one of the things that Putin realizes he needs to do is at least keep the population more or less on his side. Granted, he is a dictator. He doesn't have to worry about losing elections. But it greatly decreases the chance that you're going to be overthrown if people aren't in the streets in the hundreds of thousands complaining that they don't have food or that they're being thrown out of their homes. Putin needs to keep them at least somewhat happy so they don't cause any problems for him and his ability to rule. Anyone who's thinking to overthrow Putin would most likely be provoked if they saw that there was huge riots or people protesting, that now might be the moment that Putin is weak. We should strike. Putin will do everything possible to avoid that. As we've seen within Russia, protests have been essentially outlawed, and people rarely go to the streets. The only time that we've seen large protests recently in Russia was due to electricity cuts. So we know that people do protest. Unfortunately, they don't protest about the war or social causes because they will go to jail. But even the cops understand it's nothing wrong to protest if the energy's been cut off for a few days. So would the same thing happen if there's no food or if there's no housing for a few days? I think it's very possible. Why not? Putin must do everything he can to prevent his own people from rising up. And that's why, given a choice between maintaining the war in Ukraine or simply keeping his people happy so he can preserve power, I'm quite certain Putin will put his own priorities first and will happily pull out the troops from Ukraine to protect him in Moscow if that's what would guarantee his own security. Thank you.